Thank you so much for joining the Asia Society Policy Institute for what is truly going to be a special occasion, and that is the launch of Kevin Rudd's new book, The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict. We're so delighted to see so many friends of ASPI here and so many ambassadors, former officials, and distinguished guests. Thank you for coming. It has become common knowledge that the relationship between the United States and China is the most consequential one in the world today, and one that is at a crossroads. But what is less understood in Washington, and perhaps the West more broadly, is what makes Xi Jinping tick. Where does he ultimately want to take China? What might stand in his way? What are his global ambitions? What is his timeline? And how does the United States fit in? Kevin's new book, The Avoidable War, seeks to answer all of these questions, but it does more. In the words of Henry Kissinger, Kevin offers constructive steps for the two powers to stabilize their relations. Specifically, he outlines the case for a U.S. China roadmap called Managed Strategic Competition, where both countries are able to competitively coexist, but set up guardrails to avoid conflict. And events over the past few weeks underscore that the stakes could not be higher, particularly as China aligns itself with Russia. The Avoidable War is the culmination of a project that Kevin has been working on and thinking about for many years. But before hearing from him, we are fortunate to have Senator Mitt Romney here to deliver remarks. Senator Romney needs no introduction. He's well known here in Washington and outside the Beltway. And among his current responsibilities, he is ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on East Asia and one of Congress's leading voices on China. Amidst a myriad of proposals on how to shape the U.S. China relationship, Senator Romney has called for a holistic rethink and not just a piecemeal approach. He has also led calls for a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics and has urged U.S. preparedness for Chinese retaliation against U.S. sanctions, a matter that is becoming increasingly relevant. Biden administration efforts to cultivate multilateral cooperation in dealing with China also align with Senator Romney's views. As Australia is among the United States' closest allies, it is therefore particularly fitting to have Senator Romney offer views from Washington before we hear from Kevin. So please join me in welcoming Senator Romney to the podium.
Thank you. I should be listening to you, not the other way around, but I will nonetheless offer some thoughts. And the good news is that the thoughts I have about China and where we are actually are pretty consistent among the two parties. The chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, feels the same way as I do and as do other members of the committee. I'm sure there's some differences, but there's a great deal of coming together now with regards to China. I appreciate this book, its optimism in its title and in the prescription which it provides, and look forward to it being part of the process that we need going forward as a nation and as a civilization. My first 40 years, we were in a competition with the Soviet Union, and if that was lost on anybody back then, it was made clear when Nikita Khrushchev, I think 1956, got 12 NATO members together and said to them, "We will bury you." And he went on to say something which is not as frequently quoted: history is on our side. And what he was referring to is, if you look back over several thousand years of world history, basically every great civilization that's come and gone was led by an authoritarian. Authoritarianism is the default setting of world history. And when he said history is on our side, it was that to which he was referring, and the fact that he would bury us. Now, we had some extraordinary advantages relative to Russia. One, we were twice their size, and number two, we didn't have socialism. Socialism was an extraordinarily weak economic system to create the vitality which you need to compete. And then we put in place a strategy. And whether it was George Kennan or Dean Acheson or Harry Truman, they developed a strategy of containment or isolation of where Russia was. We would trade with other nations more freely. We would keep the commons open for trade to be able to move through the seas and through the air. And all these things combined to allow us ultimately to defeat the Soviet Union. Now we face a very different competitor. And this competitor is smarter in the way it communicates to the world. Unlike Nikita Khrushchev banging his shoe on a countertop or saying he's going to bury us, they pretend to be our best buddies and our best friends. And they have a very comprehensive and effective strategy. And I'll note that we don't. You think about the elements of their strategy. One, they've described precisely where they want to go and when they want to get there. And so, for instance, they indicate that they want to be the military leader of the world by 2049. They want to also be the economic leader of the world and the geopolitical leader of the world. That is their ambition. And then they lay out how they're going to get there. And piece by piece, militarily, for instance, they have a strategy which includes flanking Western military might. So more submarines, more taking out capacity for our aircraft carriers, more investment in space to knock out our communication systems, looking at our fighter jets saying, you know, we're not going to worry so much about the fighter jets coming from the U.S. We're going to go after the tankers that are required to get them from the U.S. and knock them out because they're big and slow and fat. And so they're making a very substantial investment in their military might currently in the Pacific, but of course they also are establishing ports through all the choke points of the world. This idea of control of the commons, which the free world has had, they're very much putting in question by establishing the ports throughout the world as they have, and also militarizing the South China Sea. A second element of their strategy is associated with a form of Marshall Plan. In the same way we invested against the Soviet Union to create the Marshall Plan and to strengthen the other nations, they've got their own form of Marshall Plan known as the Belt and Road, and other elements are allowing them to expand their economic vitality. They have decided that they want to tranquilize the people of the world. So instead of having us get worried as we were about the old Soviet Union, instead they've decided to invest dramatically in putting us to sleep and making us not think about China as being a threat. I mean, the idea, these Confucius Institutes, I don't know how familiar you are with them at our universities where Chinese professors are teaching culture and China, they spend billions upon billions of dollars to inculcate our university students with the perception that China is our friend. And this is something which is going on not just here in the U.S. but around the world. I was shocked that I felt one of the school districts in my state of Utah gets $500,000 a year from China. $500,000 for a little school district. Again, it's reaching out and tranquilizing to a great degree the people of our country. The greatest threat to their march to dominance is evidenced in their history, which is revolution and uprising. And so to deal with that, they have social scoring and facial recognition technology. They're stamping out religion. Religion often has been a source of people finding their voice and finding something more important to them than their state. And of course, minorities can often be the source of uprisings, and so they're eliminating the Uyghurs, as we know, as a minority. And then all of this is financed through an extraordinary economic engine. And it's a little like capitalism at the turn of the century, the 1900s, which is the things that are illegal to do now because we made them illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. They're able to do because they don't have that law, and we don't have it internationally. So they monopolize industries, they cross-subsidize businesses, they engage in predatory pricing. Those things we can't do under the Sherman Antitrust Act. They do because they work. And as a result, they've established monopolies. They've driven Western businesses out of business. They've monopolized key raw materials. Try and make a battery. When we talk about building batteries, guess where all the raw materials come from? Now, so they have gone at this in a very strategic sense. And against all that, this very comprehensive, effective strategy is America's strategy and the West's strategy, which we don't have. We really have not developed an approach to how we're going to deal with the emergence of China. That's one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to see this book and hopefully others. And why, incidentally, Chairman Menendez and I and others came together in the most recent National Defense Authorization Act, said, let's establish a strategy for dealing with China. Bring in outside experts, some in the government, some outside, U.S., non-U.S., and come together and talk about what is the course forward for us to be able to get China to be diverted from a course of conflict to instead a course of fair competition. So it's a challenging time. And we face this along with what's happening in Europe right now. Our hearts are heavy as we think of the many people that are suffering in Ukraine. But we must not lose focus on the greater long-term challenge to us, which is the emergence of China as the world's great power. So with that, I'm going to turn to our host here today. I want to say thank you to the ambassador and to all the ambassadors that are here. There are a number of ambassadors that are here. And appreciate him writing on this topic and appreciate you being here to hear about it. Thank you. Kevin?
Yeah, I'll sit by when you introduce.
I'm going to introduce him first. Thank you so much, Senator Romney. We are so grateful for you setting the table for this event. It's a great kickoff for today's discussion. And now I'm pleased to introduce Kevin Rudd, one of the world's leading experts on China. He has devoted much of his life to studying China's history, culture, politics, and language. He has lived in China, studied and has been a diplomat, conducted business there, and has dealt with and negotiated with Chinese policymakers at the highest levels as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Australia. Today, he serves as the President and CEO of the Asia Society, as well as the President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and also my boss. Following Kevin's remarks, I'm looking forward to moderating a conversation with him where I get to ask the questions, during which time we will welcome questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Rudd to the podium.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Mitt, thank you so much for being here. It's really kind of you. Last time I looked, this is a pretty busy town. You've got a few priorities, but you do me a great honour by attending the launch of this book. And thank you for your extraordinary service to this country and to your friends, partners and allies around the world. And long may it continue. It's so good to see others in this room today who I've known over so many years and from all sides of the aisle. To our ambassadors who are here with us today, thank you, including my own ambassador, Arthur Sinodinos from Australia. Good to have you with us, Arthur. And to those of you who are from the press, again, it's a busy town, and I appreciate the fact you've taken some time out today as well. So here in the United States right now, and right around the world, we're rightly focused on the question of the Ukraine and the unfolding horror that we see on the streets of Kiev and the other cities of that great country. My argument is pretty simple. Our common resolve across the democracies must be to defend freedom, to defend people's right to choose the governments who lead them, and to defend the rights of nation-states to live in peace and security within their nation's boundaries. Or, as Article 1 of the UN Charter reminds us all, to be free from the scourge of war. All democracies, therefore, should rally to the cause of providing this democratically elected government of Ukraine with all the material resources it needs to defend its democracy and its country. Just as all of us have a common global responsibility to share our part of the global burden in assisting the millions of Ukrainian refugees now pouring out of their blood-soaked land. It may therefore seem odd today to be launching a book entitled the avoidable war. Not between Russia and Ukraine, even though war was entirely avoidable in that case, had Putin chosen diplomacy rather than the sword. The avoidable war we speak of today, for so many of us, remains the unthinkable, and that is any future war between China and the United States. Many of our friends in Europe also thought until a month ago that another major war on the European continent was equally unthinkable, but now it has come to pass. We should therefore reflect soberly on the decade that lies ahead of us as we slide into a new, uncomfortably binary world that is divided between China and the United States. It's always problematic to reach back into the past to justify a course of action for the future. History never repeats itself, but as Mark Twain has reminded us, it often rhymes. As I reflect on the 20th century, the world's bloodiest century, if you do the math, back to when we had the war to end all wars, and that was the First World War, there are three sets of principles which remain anchored in my mind. The first is, how did we all become sleepwalkers during the extraordinary events of 1914 as we all tumbled headlong into a war which nobody wanted, which few expected, and which monarchs, prime ministers and diplomats failed to prevent? Some thought it was possible, but none saw it as being probable, until the guns of August ripped loose. If you've read my compatriot Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, you too will be haunted by how quickly the unthinkable quickly becomes very thinkable indeed. A second principle to emerge from the horrors of the 20th century is the problem of appeasement. If dictators conclude that democracies lack resolve, as Mitt has just reminded us, then the sorry history of the 1930s is that those dictators are emboldened. And so Hitler began the salami slicing of Europe until it became all too late to prevent general conflagration. If there's a third principle, perhaps it's this. Despite our near-death experience during the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the world survived, ultimately through a combination of deterrence, détente, and diplomacy. In the case of the United States, the fact that Kennan's doctrine of containment finally prevailed fully 40 years after it was conceived was due to the fact that successive administrations, both Republican and Democrat, sustained it until the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Eastern Europe was free. There are, of course, many other lessons from history, not all geopolitical. Geoeconomic lessons are rich as well. Economic enmeshment between the nations of the world may make armed conflict less probable, but certainly doesn't remove the risk altogether, particularly as we reflect once again on what happened back in 1914 in what was then a highly globalised Europe and a highly globalised international economy. Then there is our common planetary challenge of climate change. This too, as a matter of logic, should draw us together to save our shared biosphere. On this, Paris gave us cause for hope, Glasgow a little less so, but as we see a return to hydrocarbons in response to the energy challenges of the moment, think of what Thomas Paine would have called perhaps common sense. Common sense appears to be yielding to the imperatives of economics and geopolitics right now, despite the planet. So how do we draw these threads together in dealing with the challenges we all face in China's continued rise? The metrics are stark indeed. China is the world's most populous country, the world's second largest economy, the world's largest military, as well as a nuclear weapons state, and run by a Marxist-Leninist party. As I've said before in many gatherings, if and when China becomes the world's largest economy, it will be the first time since George III was on the throne of England that a non-democratic, non-Western, non-English-speaking country is the largest economy in the world. And if people don't think changes proceed from that fact, then they're smoking something. China is also now actively engaged in a series of unresolved territorial disputes along the Sino-Indian border, in the East China Sea against Japan, and the South China Sea against multiple claimant states, including US treaty ally the Philippines, and of course the biggest of them all, Taiwan. Add to these geopolitical factors the ideological and ideational divides that now separate these two worlds, as China seeks to replace an international rules-based order led by the United States with one of its own making and choosing, one which puts China at the centre and seeks to change that order's norms and rules in a manner more compatible with China's national values and interests. Taken together, these represent a heady mix of geostrategic challenges for the 3 decades that lie ahead as we move towards Xi Jinping's 2049 deadline, his target of national rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, by which point he plans for China to be the most powerful nation on earth. Let's be clear about it. Mitt referred to it before. It's there in the documents. Anyone who doesn't see it for the clarity with which it's ideologically intended in the Chinese domestic discourse, again, is choosing to hold one or both hands in front of their eyes. It is there, hiding in plain sight. So, what then is to be done? Quoting one Leninist in relation to another. What then is to be done if this is indeed to be the avoidable war, as the title of the book suggests it should be? And how do we apply the lessons of history, sleepwalking, appeasement, deterrence, diplomacy, and a common concern for the global commons, to a strategic framework which might just have some chance of reducing the possibilities of crisis, conflict, and war between these two great powers of the 21st century? At present, both Republicans and Democrats characterise the US China relationship as one of strategic competition. There may be some nuance in the description of that, but that, I think, is its essence. By contrast, in China, the Communist Party's official literature describes the period through which we are currently living as, and I quote, the rise of the East and the decline of the West. In Beijing, these are euphemisms for the rise of China and the decline of the United States. Although I suspect the collective West's unified response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, including the imposition of punishing financial sanctions against Moscow and something of a geopolitical reawakening in Berlin, may have given China some temporary pause, some temporary pragmatic pause in its ideological euphoria about the inevitable decline of the West. Beneath the surface, China also recognises that it is in deep strategic competition with the United States, even though they choose not to use that term. Competition with the United States for regional and global preponderance, militarily, economically, and technologically. As for Xi Jinping, he plans to be in office until about the mid-1930s, 2030s, not 1930s, assuming his likely reappointment at the 20th Party Congress this November, by which point he would merely be in his mid-80s. It is my judgment that Xi Jinping is likely to seek to use military means to recover Taiwan if that cannot be done by political means. And that Xi also wishes to see this happen within his political lifetime. We should not accept the panicked assumptions of some that this will happen any time soon. In my judgment, it would only happen when China believes that the balance of military power was overwhelmingly in China's advantage in East Asia, and when financially and economically it would be powerful enough, that's China, to withstand international financial sanctions of the type we have seen just meted out to the Russian Federation. Neither of these two conditions exist at present, but China is seeking to remedy both of them. That means, in my judgment, it's more likely to be later this decade or early in the next, but still on Xi Jinping's political watch, that action against Taiwan would be taken. Because Xi, like Vladimir Putin, sees himself as a man of history, seeking to recover lost national territory. And the sad history of our human race is that the recovery of lost national territory results in many, many problematic consequences for us all. If you accept the logic I've just outlined, that means we've entered what I now call routinely the decade of living dangerously. The decade of living dangerously, from now through to the mid-2030s. And the question, therefore, is how best to preserve the peace and defend freedom during what will be difficult and destabilising times. To do so, what I argue in the pages of this book is that it might just be possible to develop a joint strategic framework between Washington and Beijing of what I call managed strategic competition. I'm a simple Australian. I grew up on a farm and I have a pretty simple approach to things. We had beef and dairy. My father's first question to me as a kid growing up on the farm was, have I made up my choice in life, the decision about what I wanted to do? He was sitting on a large horse and I was sitting on a little horse, and we were watching the cattle come in, and I didn't have an idea what he meant. Had I made up my choice for the future, my decision on my future? And he said, well, you've got two choices in life. It's either beef or dairy. And Mitt, that's when I discovered an interest in foreign policy. It was an escape from a future career in Australian animal husbandry, where I would have failed miserably. But as I said, I have a pretty simple farm-based approach to logic, which is strategic competition can either be unmanaged, that is, there are no rules of the road, or it can be managed in the sense that there are some basic guardrails put in place with agreement from both sides to prevent the relationship from spinning out of control by accident rather than by design. This becomes even more critical when the stock of political and diplomatic capital available in the bilateral relationship has been depleted to near zero. And that is the point that we have about reached now in the U.S. China relationship. It's pretty bare in the barrel. When there is negligible trust, goodwill, or even open lines of political communication available, the risk of radical strategic miscalculation is very large. Remember 1914. But there is no particular rocket science to my concept of managed strategic competition, and others, including David Shambaugh, with us today, have been writing about this in a slightly different way for some time. I've been working on this since I wrote a research paper at the Harvard Kennedy School with my friend and colleague Graham Allison back in 2014. The issue was less pressing then than it is now, and I've been writing articles and delivering speeches on this concept in the years since then. There are four components to manage strategic competition. Number one, the United States and China must both develop a clear understanding of the other's irreducible strategic red lines in order to help prevent conflict through miscalculation. I'm talking about private understanding, not public declaratory understanding. Each side must be persuaded to conclude that enhancing strategic predictability advantages both countries, that strategic deception, long a principle in Chinese foreign and security policy, is futile, and strategic surprise is just plain dangerous. This will require granular diplomatic understandings on Taiwan. Second, the two sides would then channel the burden of strategic rivalry into a competitive race to enhance their military, economic and technological capabilities. Properly constrained, such competition aims to deter armed conflict rather than tempt either side to risk all by prosecuting what would become a dangerous and bloody war with deeply unpredictable results. Remember the first line of Sun-Tzu's Art of War. War is a great matter of state, not to be undertaken lightly. If you lose the war, you lose the state. This is etched deeply into the cerebral cortex of every single Chinese political leader that I have ever met, and military leader as well. Such strategic competition, if managed, therefore, would also enable both sides to maximise their political, economic and ideological appeal to the rest of the world. Its strategic rationale would be that the most competitive power would ultimately prevail by becoming or remaining the world's foremost power, with Armageddon avoided. And may the best system win. And I think you know which system I would back in such a race. Third, this framework would create the political space necessary also for the two countries to continue to engage in strategic cooperation in a number of defined areas where both their global and national interests would be enhanced by such collaboration, and indeed undermined by the absence of an agreed collaborative approach. Climate looms large on this list, the world's two largest polluters. The next pandemic, I think, would come second. And then there is the tricky business of maintaining global financial stability, given the challenges that now lie ahead for us all. And fourth, last point, for this compartmentalisation of the relationship to have any prospect of success, it would need to be policed by a dedicated senior official on either side of the relationship. On the US side, that would be either the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor. On the Chinese side, either the Director of the Foreign Affairs Office of the Central Committee or the Vice Chairs of the Central Military Commission, or all the above. But quick decisions will require a dedicated group of such officials policing the relationship in order to avoid disaster. Of course, it's important to be realistic. No joint strategic framework can in itself prevent war, but properly constructed and based on clarity, transparency and, most importantly, credible deterrence, it may significantly reduce the risk of it. Such a framework would also keep alive the possibility of political change, the evolution of each side's worldview, or the emergence of new ways of thinking about old problems, both conceptual and even technological, and better managing great power relations in the complex world of the later 21st century. My interest is how we navigate the dangerous decade which lies immediately ahead. We can't think constructively about the long-term future if the medium-term future destroys us all. Most importantly, it may cause both the Chinese and the Americans to conclude that after more than 150 years of one form or another of political engagement with each other, that they are not destined for war. And punching that message through to the peoples of China is no bad thing. To conclude, I'm sure the approach I recommend in this book will be roundly criticised both in Washington and Beijing as not being sufficiently sensitive to the realities of each side's core national interests. It may even be described as naive, though I think if you work your way through the pages of it, including its analysis of Xi Jinping's 10 sets of core regional and global interests, it is a deeply realist analysis. I'm not a member of the Kumbaya school of international relations theory. This is a deeply realist text. It just thinks that blowing each other's brains out is not a good way to proceed. But here's my challenge to the critics of managed strategic competition. Please come up with something else. You want to have a war? Go right ahead. If you want to appease, go right ahead. I wouldn't back that. But what's the way through this which is credible, realist and deterrence-based? For those, for example, who argue for deterrence, the reality is that deterrence forms a core component of the four-part structure I have just recommended. For those legitimately concerned about the appearance of appeasement, managed strategic competition does nothing of the sort, because there is an internal clarity to the strategic red lines that have been set, including on the question of Taiwan. And for those concerned, as I am, and many are, about sleepwalking into war, thinking that it's so unthinkable it just couldn't happen, the whole point of two sets of senior officials acting as policemen of the strategic stability of the overall relationship is that it seeks to avoid, by conscious design, the political and diplomatic inertia followed by rapid and crazed mobilisations that we saw in the horrendous month of July 1914, when nobody was talking to anybody, much. And for those who legitimately believe that for the sake of the global environmental commons, these two countries need to work together to save the planet, managed strategic competition offers a possible vehicle for collaboration on the things that matter for the biosphere. To succeed, managed strategic competition would need to be embraced in Beijing as well. The Chinese will argue that the framework I have outlined does not sufficiently accommodate their interests, most particularly on Taiwan. But our Chinese friends should reflect on the fact that crisis, miscalculation, conflict and war, and as our Russian friends have just discovered, all the uncertainties that this involves, that crisis, miscalculation, conflict and war doesn't suit China's interests either. For the United States, for such an approach to work, it would require a level of bipartisan buy-in to a coherent long-term China strategy that Mitt referred to before, transcending the normal partisan divide and the daily blood sport of domestic American politics, which as an Australian politician I fully identify with. But America has in its history, its remarkable history, time and again proven that it is capable of uniting when the future of the Republic itself is at stake and when the future of the Republic desperately needs it. And that time, I believe, has well and truly come on the China question. I've lived and worked in America now for 5 of the last 7 years. I've had a 2-year COVID sojourn down under. But they finally let us all out of the criminal colony, and we're back. At the beginning of my career, I lived, worked and studied for some 3 years in Hong Kong, Taipei, Shanghai and Beijing. In Beijing I worked in our embassy. I know both these countries quite well, and I know their civilizational traditions really well. And for different reasons, I admire them both. Quite different reasons, I admire them both. The time has come for statesmanship to deliver us from the peril that potentially lies ahead for us all. And I hope this book and the ideas contained within it might make a small contribution to this great task. Thank you for being here today.
So, Kevin, you've described your joint framework of managed strategic competition, and the Biden administration has an approach of 3 C's right now: competition, collaboration, confrontation. How does the approach you're suggesting differ from the Biden approach? Is it more because both sides would sit down at the table and work things out between them in the 4 categories of issues you mentioned?
Well, as I said, Wendy, a number of us have been working on this over quite a number of years. As I referred before to Professor Shambo and others, myself, we've been writing on it. But as I said, it's not rocket science. I'm pleased that the administration has begun to elaborate this sort of framework. Tony Blinken's description of the 3 C's very early in the period of this administration, I think, was about right. What's the difference? Probably twofold. One is the urgent need to populate each of the 3 categories with a level of granularity that makes a real difference. We can talk about the 3 categories until the cows come home. But the bottom line is, until they are populated, as I said, with some granularity on the question internally of Taiwan, but also the East China Sea and South China Sea, but also cyber and space, then frankly it's a concept which would swing in the breeze. And similarly with the other 2 categories that I've outlined. The other difference, I think, Wendy, is this. What we see evolving is a de facto mechanism for policing the relationship with the National Security Advisor of the United States, Jake Sullivan, and Yang Jiechi on the Chinese side. But it needs to be taken one step further. The Chinese side internally is utterly bifurcated between the foreign policy and military sources of advice to the Chinese President Xi Jinping. The Central Military Commission provide the military advice. The Foreign Ministry and the foreign policy establishment have this much control over the Chinese military, or less than that. Therefore, for those reasons, what's missing in the machinery is to pull in my argument, the vice chairs of the Central Military Commission, so that there is a conjoint responsibility on their side. If the National Security Advisor here can comfortably speak for all dimensions of the U.S. China relationship, then he or she can do that alone. But if the team need to be expanded a bit, then think about the Secretary of State, think about the Secretary of Defense. But I probably wouldn't go beyond that, despite my good friend David Lipton's presence, who is Counselor, I should say, to the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. David, back to you.
So to embark on your framework, it seems to me there needs to be some trust between both sides, but in reality, I think there's a real deficit in trust, if any trust now. How do you build trust to make your prescription work?
Actually, that's where I partly would disagree with you, Wendy. This requires zero trust. It actually is based entirely on interests and balance of power, and a framework for managing that, and the classical framework of old-style diplomacy. I recall a former head of what we then quaintly call SINCPAC. Now it's Indo-Pacific Command. In the medium term, it was called, I think, Pacific Command. But there you go. In the evolution of it, an admiral, much decorated, said to me, "You know, Kevin, dealing with the Chinese, trust is a much overrated thing." And I therefore have taken that as kind of the leitmotif of where things have reached in the overall U.S. China relationship, and on both sides. So no, this is not an appeal to trust or how to construct it. It's an appeal to basic elemental national security interests and how to construct an utterly pragmatic dialogue based on it to avoid accidentally blowing each other's brains out. And over time, hopefully, as the machinery began to operate, operationally to construct levels of mutual comfort, not trust, with each other. It's still subject to, let's call it, strategic surprise. And I understand well the importance of deception within China's classic military thinking. I mean, we've all read the text. Evan Feigenbaum's here. When we were all at graduate school, we all read this stuff and had to memorize it. But no, trust ain't part of the equation. I agree with the Admiral.
Maybe we can turn to the relationship between Putin and Xi. And your book was written before the events that we're all witnessing with horror today. And in your book, you mentioned that Xi is publicly said that Putin is his best friend, and that they call each other on birthdays. And I don't know, they've had, I think, 37 meetings, mostly virtual, over the past few years.
Now 38, Wendy.
Now 38. What does Xi Jinping gain from this relationship? And do you think now maybe he's reassessing the relationship, that maybe the costs are becoming greater than the benefits he seeks to derive? Or is that wishful thinking?
Largely wishful thinking, I think. I read with some trepidation this morning what I wrote at the end of last year when we had to close the text, about what I'd written about China and Russia. And when you have those come to Jesus moments when you think, oh my God, what have I written on this? Actually, it holds up okay. Fortunately, I'd spent a fair bit of time in Moscow in the period since I've left political office in Australia, speaking to Russian think tanks about their view of the evolving China-Russia relationship. So what that entrenched in my mind, Wendy, was simply this, that the baseline Chinese strategic interest with Russia hasn't changed. It's become accentuated under Xi Jinping. One, China has enormous advantage of being able to regard this massive common land border with the Russian Federation as benign. For most of its history, it is not, over the last 400 years since the Tsarist expansion to the east, apart from that period of Sino-Soviet collaboration between 49 and 59. That's kind of the exception, until this evolution, which has occurred since 89, but most intensely in the last decade. Number two, that means that releases China's strategic energies to be directed at its principal global and regional strategic adversary, namely the United States. And three, that's the Russian view as well, in, let's call it, the European hemisphere, as opposed to the Eastern hemisphere. And finally, though the Chinese would never admit it publicly, they kind of like the idea that their Russian friends, who are always predisposed to be more out loud and proud on the question of assertive forms of foreign policy and security policy behavior than China, because China still sees itself as the global superpower of the 21st century and therefore needing to have greater global cred than Russia, the declining power. The Chinese still see operational utility in having the Russians engaged in actions which strategically distract the United States from its principal challenge, whether that's in Europe, as we now see with Ukraine, or in the Middle East, as we've seen most recently in Syria, but frankly more broadly now in the Middle East as well. So for those reasons, what will Xi Jinping do about his current posture of tacit support for Russia's position in Ukraine? I think the likelihood of China moving any time soon to abandon Putin, the likelihood of that is next to nothing. You have started to see some modest political and diplomatic crab walk, but that's in political and diplomatic language, like that, as opposed to anything that's more substantive. If, I believe, Xi Jinping and his military advisors concluded that Putin was in danger of imminently losing the field battle in Ukraine, and that stage is not reached yet, then fasten your seatbelts for a 5 minutes to midnight Chinese diplomatic intervention to try and, as it were, quickly gain some credibility in the eyes of the Europeans for bringing about a ceasefire under those circumstances. I think that is the reality. One footnote. If, as we see reported in the press most recently, sourced, I think, to a series of US intelligence briefings, that Russia was about to cross the tripwire in the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine, or, perish the thought, other categories of weapons of mass destruction, including tactical nuclear weapons, I believe that would then cross a line deeply, the Chinese foreign policy and national security policy establishment, that they could not handle. And if they got wind of that was imminent, if there's likely to be a single clear communication from the Chinese Central Military Commission to their Russian counterparts, it would be, don't do that. Xi, as many of our China analysts here will know, is under some domestic political pressure because the decision to provide tacit support to Putin and the content of that extraordinary document they jointly agreed on the 4th of February, the joint strategic framework between Russia and China, he is way out ahead of his skis in terms of the rest of the Chinese foreign security policy establishment. So it doesn't mean that Xi, if Putin fails in Ukraine, that Xi therefore is in terminal political trouble. No. But it does mean that he then has a new set of strong headwinds operating against him, together with others, arising from the slowing economy, arising from the pandemic, arising from the normal neuralgia over electing a leader for life this November at the 20th Party Congress. But this stuff could come together and create a more potent political mix of issues for him to wrestle with in the lead up to the 20th Congress.
Okay, well, maybe we can tease that out a bit. So the 20th Party Congress is around the corner, about 7 months away. When your book was written, you mentioned a number of possible headwinds facing Xi this year, and I think at the top of the list you put the economic headwinds, talking about the private sector crackdown, and now we have the COVID lockdowns and the real estate problems. How do you see these economic challenges now? And do you think the announcements that have been made over the past week by Li He to provide some stability to the financial markets and to support growth, do you see that addressing some of these economic challenges that Xi is facing?
Not fundamentally. I think Liu He's statement of a week or so ago and the 6 measures he referred to was an emergency, what I describe as financial band-aid over what has been rapidly slowing growth within the Chinese economy. There's a big, as the Chinese would say, dialectical debate underway in China at the moment over the future course of economic policy. It's pretty fundamental, actually. Its origins, for those of us in the analytical community, goes back to the 19th Party Congress. And in the arcane world of Chinese dialectical studies, which Marxist-Leninists take seriously, it was a redefinition of the central ideological priorities of the entire operation. Away from Deng's view that the paramount importance for China lay in continued untrammeled economic development, towards a much more interventionist view concerning unbalanced development, but within that inequality, and within that social inequality, and within that the problems of class, which if you are a Marxist-Leninist, you take seriously. And Xi Jinping has been on that side of the argument. And in a series of statements since the 19th Party Congress in 2017, and a series of measures, whether it's the Common Prosperity Agenda, or whether it's national economic self-sufficiency, or whether it's the rebirthing of state-owned enterprises, or whether it's the correctives announced against the private sector, including but not restricted to the tech platforms, put all that together, Chinese private sector, kind of like private sectors anywhere, they're driven by animal spirits. And basically this guy is trying to put the animal spirits back in a cage. They don't like it. So what do? They put their cash under the mattress. So you want to look at sort of big barometers as to why growth is slowing. The biggest barometer is the real data on private fixed capital investment. And guess what? All those folks that we know in the Chinese private sector are going, where am I going to put my money? And it's not in fresh investment in new plant and equipment in this country, because I'm not sure that I any longer have a predictable policy environment. So when Liu He did what he did the other day, and Liu He is on the other side of this argument in Beijing, Liu He was, as it were, trying to staunch the flow of blood, which is occurring in terms of the loss of momentum behind growth. But staunching is different from healing, and it's different to restoring. And if you're a Chinese private sector entrepreneur looking at the entrails of what's happened over the last 5 years, you would still have a problem of confidence about has this fundamentally changed, or is it just tactically changing? So to therefore respond to the macro question, I think slowing growth through to November still represents a significant headwind in the domestic political debate. Remember Xi Jinping at the end of last year, Wendy, said, we want a stable 2022 as we all make preparations for the 20th Party Congress. Well, politics is a funny old thing for those of you who've been in it. Arthur used to be in the Australian Senate, for example, and we understand just the unpredictabilities of what's dealt up to you each day. But if you were Xi Jinping in the middle of 2022, Ukraine going bang, pandemic jumping the border from Hong Kong and ripping itself across 70 Chinese cities, with a number of them now in lockdown covering 50 million people, and you've got Putin screwing up the blitzkrieg in Ukraine. On the score sheet of, is this looking like a stable year, comrade? You would say, not entirely. So it doesn't mean that this guy is not going to get reappointed, but it makes for a much more volatile political year than perhaps many of us thought at the end of last year.
And where does Taiwan fit in? I know some people in the United States are making parallels between the Ukraine and Taiwan. You just mentioned during your remarks that you don't think Xi Jinping is ready now to make a move on Taiwan. Maybe you can elaborate what he's thinking and why he would wait. And I'd also ask you, do you think what's going on in the Ukraine may be giving him some pause, or may lead him to reassess his calculation in terms of how difficult it's been for the Russian army to take over Ukraine, and also the quick and strong unity among the West with respect to sanctions?
Yeah, I think there are many China analysts in our gathering here today, and I don't want to speak on behalf of all of them, because you'll all have different and nuanced views of this, but my general analysis is that there's just been too many forced comparisons between Ukraine and Taiwan from the perspective of the Chinese leadership and how they view their own strategic timetable for dealing with the Taiwan question. As I said in my prepared remarks before, my judgment at this stage is 2020s, all right. Late 2020s into the 2030s, we start to get to a very difficult time because of changing balance of military power in the Taiwan Straits, depending on what the Taiwanese do themselves and depending on what the United States does. The deterrent question there is critical and central. And then secondly, on the financial side, I think the one telling message out of Ukraine is, do sanctions work in crippling an economy, or do they only work partially and temporarily? And the Chinese will have a long analytical study of this. But remember, The Chinese game plan would never be to put at risk their economy fundamentally by a military attack on Taiwan until their economy and financial system is big enough, bold enough, ugly enough, and internationalised enough to not face the risk of US dollar-denominated sanctions, fundamentally undermining their growth. And that means you've got to reach a stage, in my judgment, where they have taken a decision, maybe by decade's end, to have opened the Chinese capital account, liberalised the RMB, and engaged in a competition with the United States dollar. Because right now, they are vulnerable to a dollar-denominated US financial system globally. They are. That's the truth, and they know it. You speak to our friends in Beijing after you've had a glass or two, you soon get onto this subject, which is why we all miss not being in Beijing to pick up the granularity of the internal discussion there. So for those reasons, I think we're not looking at an imminent threat. One caveat is Taiwanese domestic politics doing something really stupid on the way through. There are presidential primaries for 2024. No one knows what's going to be thrown up by the Democratic Progress Party domestically. Always worth keeping a weather eye. And that's why I'm always in the business of US strategic ambiguity is the best way of handling the internalities of Taiwanese democratic politics. I think it is an enduring lesson from Ukraine. Xi Jinping will still see himself as a great man of history, but I think there will be a degree of anxiety at the Bai building in Beijing, the home of the PLA, where I've had a few meetings over the years, and the home of the Central Military Commission, where Ukraine was a land-based operation, like just down the road. There's a stretch of water between the Chinese mainland and Taiwan, and amphibious operations are tricky. Remember Eisenhower's planning for D-Day? That's just across the English Channel, for God's sake. This is big, and it's open water, and it's tricky. Political timetable, I think, in Xi Jinping's mind is relatively clear, given the caveats that I've just attached. But the military, frankly, will be looking at this and studying the videos late at night for the next few years in terms of what could be coming down the track towards them.
We'd like to open the floor up for questions. We have a microphone there. If you can go up to the microphone and I can call on you, maybe take a couple at a time. If you can keep your question to just one question and introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Thank you. Alden Meyer with E3G, Third Environmentalism. Brilliant overview. We're looking, of course, at Ukraine not just being a humanitarian crisis and a security crisis, but an economic crisis. Energy price spikes, food supply shortages, food shocks, on top of the debt crisis, COVID crisis, climate crisis. Last time we faced this in 2008, 2009, we had the G20 as a functioning space. It's hard to see Indonesia keeping G20 focused on what it needs to do, given the split between the West and Putin. It's hard to imagine Biden and von der Leyen and others being in a room with Putin. It's hard to imagine China and India allowing Russia to be excluded from the G20 the way they were from the G8. Is there a space where Europe, the US, and China can collaborate on managing the economic crisis we're now facing outside of the formal G20 structure or other multilateral spaces?
Yeah, you're right to point to a threshold question. What happens with Russia and the G20? Remember what happened with what was then the G8 becoming the G7 after Crimea. This is a threshold question. And the second threshold question is if Russia, by a majority, is not invited to the next G20 summit, what will then China do? And frankly, what would India then do? And are you therefore looking at a terminal moment for the G20? This is really tricky. If I was in government, I would find it just as tricky as anybody else. My overall argument is that, not least for the global economy and global economic stability, that you'll need to sustain the threadbare mechanisms of global governance intact. And therefore, I would strongly counsel that the G20 convene and that it remain as a continuing body which is functional on the question of global economic governance. As Churchill said on these questions, always better to jaw than to war. And I tend to agree with him. There's going to be enough fisticuffs in every other forum. Do you want to actually throw this one out the back window as well? I don't think it serves anyone's interests. I think the second point is, in terms of the Indonesians hosting, my experience of the G20 in the past, I was around for the birth of it as a summit mechanism, is that it really takes 4 or 5 governments, frankly, to gather around the host country to make it work wherever it is. If that happens, then it works. If it doesn't, then you get a bit of a rambling communique and no particular outcome. So given where we are in geopolitics, geoeconomics, and frankly the unresolved questions of the global pandemic, because that ain't out the window yet, then I would strongly encourage other governments to band around our friends in Jakarta to turn this into as robust a G20 summit as possible. I think that's where my instincts lie.
Other questions? Carolyn.
Hi, thanks very much, Kevin. Caroline Atkinson of the Rock Creek Group, but also ASPI Institute. First on the G20, I was present at the creation in the 90s, actually, of the Finance Ministry group, and then, of course, it went to leaders in 2008. So I was just thinking maybe one way to go forward would be to put it back to finance ministers and not have leaders. But anyway, that's just an idea that came to me because that might be an easier mechanism. Going to the economics, I'm curious, I'm interested that you say let's not expand it to the Treasury Department because the collaboration, because in my experience, on economic and financial matters, it is actually easier to find some common ground. And wouldn't that be a useful thing? But maybe, and this is my question to you really, my second question, you mentioned about the military foreign policy divide in China. Does that mean that, how does one get around that? And is there also a military foreign policy economic divide that is too complicated to try to meet on the Chinese side?
Yeah, thank you for those comments and questions. I think on the first part I'd simply say this, that why I would seek to keep, let's call it the policeman of the relationship to a narrow group around foreign policy and security policy is this. That's the really hard stuff. That's where frankly the disagreements are rife, complex and deep. The other, and I've been in recent high-level forums between the United States and China on common financial interests, all those guys talk the same dialect. Okay, it's true. They talk Wall Street, and or they talk IMF talk. And you sit among them, and it's a very convivial discussion. At the end they say, I wish all these political and security guys could agree like we do. Well, you're not running the PLA, you're not running the United States Armed Forces, and you're not running the State Department or the Chinese Foreign Ministry, but you're dealing with the really hard, in-your-face stuff, which frankly can derail anything and everything. So my argument in terms of keeping it narrow to, let's call it, people on the nasty side of the operation in both countries, is that frankly we are now in an uber-realist moment, where unless you've got those people engaging in an uber-realist fashion with a couple of folk with whom they have a professional relationship and who know that cheating doesn't work in this age of 24-hour transparent surveillance, I would keep it as tight as that. In terms of the second question you asked, which is the divides in China, I'll be very brief on this. I think the United States administration and their use of the intelligence community briefings in the last month, and more now, because it became before Ukraine, has been actually very good. I'm sure people don't normally go out there and thank people for leaking intelligence secrets, but I'm an irresponsible head of an American think tank. I can now say whatever I like. But frankly, not only is it, I'm not a Russia expert, but not only as I think it's a useful tool in terms of, shall we say, common political consciousness in Moscow, I know for a fact it is a very useful factor in China, where you have highly siloed arrangements between the military on the one hand, the foreign policy establishment on the other. I'll give you the case study, which is the much vexed briefings of a week or two ago about the Russian request and the American response for military equipment. I'm not in the intelligence community anymore. I'm not in the loop, and I don't want to be. So therefore, I can't comment on the accuracy or otherwise. But what I know for a fact is it's entirely conceivable, given the nature of the Chinese system, for the Russian military command to deal directly with the Central Military Commission, completely leaving the foreign policy establishment out of the loop altogether. Therefore, the American purpose, in my judgment, in A, putting that out there, B, Jake Sullivan directly addressing this with Yang Jiechi in Rome, and then President Biden putting it on the table directly in the Xi Jinping conversation last week, was to ensure that the entire Chinese system knew that the request had been made, and that if it was to be answered positively, the consequences would flow. So I think that's the best way to deal with it. Good. How are you, mate?
Our last question, Kurt Tom.
Sorry. Thank you, and I hate to keep people, but a question I really would like to ask Prime Minister is, with respect to highest level political risk, clearly that you outlined a very eminently sensible framework for management of U.S. China relations. At the highest level, risk is introduced by our top leaders. We have risk on the U.S. side through our electoral process. Could you comment on that if you'd like, but also you've had the opportunity to meet Xi Jinping and take the estimate of him. What is your level of confidence that he will be a rational actor throughout an entire decade of living dangerously?
That's a great question, Kurt, which could land me into all sorts of trouble in both countries. But in for a penny, in for a pound. What do you think, Arthur? I think in politics and diplomacy, you can do what you can do, okay? And that is, if you ultimately have irrational actors, then there is a limit to what externals can do in dealing with that. All I'm on about is maximising the high-level, direct, strategic and diplomatic communication between the two sides, which, in my judgment, at present is lacking. I think the second point is this. I always reflect on history. If we seem to think now that there was a halcyon period in American politics and everything was fine and dandy and everyone agreed on everything, oh, I'm not an American. But as I read my American history, right from Truman, which is where Kennan's containment doctrine came from, and through to Eisenhower, and then through to Kennedy, and then through to Johnson, and then through to Nixon, and then through to the present. There have been enormously contentious debates on most aspects of US foreign security policy. But you know something? Containment survived all of that. And I think through a number of grown-ups in each room within the American political establishment, holding the fabric of that, the essential fabric of it together, there were ebbs and flows around the margin. Now, I'm speaking in this room with many practitioners like John Negroponte who have seen the ugly side of this in terms of what would happen at a particular time. So therefore, my argument, I think, Kurt, is that if that could have survived and produced a successful result over that 40-year period, then I argue from the premise that it should have some capacity for sustainability for the 30 years which lies ahead of us in these decades of living dangerously, but the one coming up, in my judgment, the most dangerous. On the Chinese side, which I've carefully avoided in my answer to your question, I think we have probably the reverse problem now with Xi Jinping, which is isolated emperor syndrome. I am deeply concerned from just my own conversations with practitioners of the extent to which genuinely synthesized, fearless and frank advice about how Xi Jinping's doctrine is being read and seen around the world as being effectively reflected back to him. I'm not sure that this is seen as a career-enhancing move on the part of senior Chinese officials to say, hey, Comrade Xi, this great statement that you've put out there on common prosperity, it's going really well in the economy. The private sector love it. That's why all of our production numbers are going up when the reverse is the case. So applying that to the political and foreign policy realities, I think there is a virtue in having this continued reality check at that level of the relationship. Not perfect, doesn't solve everything. And this, to conclude on this as a text, it is not an idealist text. If you read this book that I've written, it is deeply realist. In simply saying, we are where we are. But if we simply say we are where we are, and therefore we'll all go to hell, because we can't stop crisis, conflict and war, I don't think that's responsible. And hence my argument for strategic guardrails to maybe see us through this ugly decade ahead. Thank you, Wendy.
I think that's an optimistic note we're concluding on. I'm sure you'll all agree that Kevin's insights and perspectives are just invaluable as we all think about how we can navigate our relationship with China going forward. We've just kind of touched the surface of this book. I've read it, I studied it in advance of today, and I really recommend it to everyone. There are copies of the book here, and I would urge you all to read it. Thank you so much for coming, and let's continue the conversation.